Washington Journal continues.
Senator Tom Coburn, let's begin. Welcome back to the Washington Journal. Let's begin with the Gang of Six, and we can show our viewers who that includes. You're part of it, a bipartisan group of 6 senators that are working behind the scenes on a plan to tackle the deficit and the debt. It includes Budget Chairman Kent Conrad, Assistant Majority Leader Dick Durbin, Mark Warner, yourself, Mike Crapo, Saxby Chambliss, 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats. This is the headline coming out of yesterday's meeting on the Wall Street Journal wire. It says, "For Gang of Six, mum's the word." Why?
Well, you can't negotiate these things in the press. And you know, it's difficult to take somebody like Dick Durbin and Tom Coburn, who are at the ends of both spectrum, and negotiate, make hard decisions and hard compromises if you're doing it in public life, because anybody that is against what you're doing is going to be critical of it. And we don't know what, you know, we're not there yet, so any comment on what we're doing or how we're doing it is inappropriate and also handicaps the ability to try to come to something that will really help our country. And, you know, that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to put forward a process where we can actually get out of the very deep hole this country's in. And I think most Americans don't realize. They realize we're in trouble, and they realize there's tremendous amounts of waste in Washington, but they don't really realize the impact that's getting ready to hit this country if, in fact, we don't fix things. And you know, if you, just a 1% increase in interest rates will cost us $150 billion a year. And right now we're borrowing money at 2% on average. And our historical rate is 6%. So, you know, 1% change, if we went back to historical averages, you'd add $600 billion more to the deficit this year. So the importance of us sending a signal to the international financial community that we get it, we know we have to start changing things. And it doesn't have to be all austerity. It's about prosperity, and how do we reestablish prosperity for the American people and generate an economy that fulfills the job needs of Americans and also will enhance the revenue to the federal government.
What's your reaction when people, if people were to say these are secret talks, and that's what the American people don't like?
Well, they're not secret talks. They're a combination of hard negotiations and compromise to get to a point where we can put something out where that can be debated. You know, what we decide isn't going to be the final thing. It's going to be what can we decide that we can put on the floor of the Senate together and then have it debated fully in front of the American people. So the question is if you want, you know, I voted for the Deficit Commission report, and it's a shame we didn't get 14 out of the 18, but we did get 11, and that's over 60%. That's a magic number in the Senate, 60. And so, you know, we have to solve this problem, and I'm not going to get everything I want, and Dick Durbin isn't going to get everything he wants, and every American's going to have to share in the sacrifice. I don't care who you are, but if we don't, the future is not bright for our country. And so, you know, and that's why this report is important, because this report, which your listeners should understand, this is just a look at a third of the discretionary programs in the federal government, just a third. When I asked for this report originally, the GAO told me it was too difficult to do. So I went to CRS, the Congressional Research Service, and I said, I need a list of every government program. I said, we can't do it, it's too big. Nobody's ever accomplished that. So I put it into the last debt limit extension, and now we get the first third, and everybody's aghast. This is stuff we've been talking about for the last 5 years out of my office. We've been offering amendments that have been routinely voted down. Now all of a sudden they're acceptable. And so we have big problems. All these programs that are listed here came out of somebody wanting to do the right thing to help somebody. But poor congressional action, no oversight, no metrics, no evaluation of what we're doing.
I want to just let our viewers know a little bit more about the report, because it was in yesterday's Wall Street Journal, the headline on this report, and show it to our viewers. Billions in bloat uncovered in Beltway. And if you take a look at some of the highlights here from this GAO report, as the Senator was talking about, there's about 100 separate surface transportation programs. There are 18 food and nutrition assistant programs, 80 economic development programs across 4 agencies, 5 departments and 8 agencies, and more than 24 presidential appointees focused on bioterrorism, and 20 agencies operate 56 different programs on financial literacy. And our viewers probably want to talk to you about this a little bit more. But let me get back to the Gang of Six and tie this in. Is that something that you guys are looking at, these duplicative and overlapping federal agencies to try to get at the deficit?
Well, no, we're not that specific.
Okay.
We're looking at discretionary, we're looking at mandatory programs, and we're also looking how do you reform the tax code that generates greater economic growth in this country. You know, the corporations in this country pay one of the highest corporate tax rates in the world. And consequently, we have the vast majority of the expansion of American large business outside of our country. And the reason is because we have a tax code that says don't come produce here, don't create jobs here. So how do we bring a tax code down that competes in the world and is fair and that will actually create increased economic growth and put capital in America, which will create jobs? So we're trying to look at every aspect of it, and we're not talking about specifics, but we know that if we don't do that, then we're not going to fulfill the needs of American people.
There have been reports that you guys are on sort of you have 2 proposals, 2 different tracks that you're working on. Can you speak to that a little bit?
No, I'm not going to comment on any of that because nothing's decided, and we're in very difficult phase of trying to come to an agreement on how much pain can each side take, and how do we put ourselves in a position where not doing something is worse than doing something that you don't necessarily want to do.
And pain for the Republican side of the aisle.
And the Democrat side.
But pain for the Republican side of the aisle includes what?
Any type of tax increase.
Defense spending?
I don't think so. I think most people recognize our problems in defense spending is I think everybody, Democrat and Republican, want us to defend this country. The problem is we haven't had great accounting in the Defense Department. They can't even audit their books. And so there's a tremendous amount of waste because they don't know what they're doing. So they're not managed well. And what the effort has been, both in the House and the Senate, both Democrat and Republican, is to bring them in line with generally accepted accounting standards where they can audit. You cannot manage what you can't measure, and the Pentagon can't measure half of the things they're doing. And so there's at least $50 billion a year, $500 billion every 10 years that could come out of the Defense Department just through efficiency, just knowing what you're doing. And what our goal has been to try to get the top leadership to buy into that in the Pentagon. You know, when Admiral Mullen, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, says the greatest risk to America is its debt, first of all, he's right, because in history, all republics failed over fiscal issues before they were ever failed militarily or economically. They failed over fiscal issues, and that's a risk for us. And so when he's saying that, what he's also saying is, Pentagon, you got to get your act together in terms of being able to spend this money wisely and appropriately so that we get good value for every dollar that we spend defending this country.
One last question about the Gang of Six. Is there a timeline for you guys? Do you have a date that you're working with to try to get something to the floor?
No, we're trying to get where we can get to solve the problem. And we, quite frankly, we may not be successful. But the point is, what I would say to the American people is it's worth every one of us losing our jobs if we solve this problem, because then we will have accomplished something great for America.
Is that the general consensus, would you say, of the 6 of you?
I think we're willing to do what is necessary to put online something that will get us back in the current of economic growth and American exceptionalism. And that's why, again, I go back to this report. This report is not an indictment of any administration. It's not an indictment of the Bush or the Obama administration. This report is an indictment of Congress. Congress created all these programs. Congress appropriates the money for all these programs. Congress has failed to do the oversight and the proper legislative actions to put metrics on programs, to measure whether they're effective, and not allow, for example, 21 federal programs for obesity. And the ones you talk about, financial literacy, can you imagine that the federal government's spending money on financial literacy and we can't even control ourselves? I mean, you know, the paradoxes and just the obnoxiousness of what we do in light of what our own behavior is astounding.
The GAO report, by the way, is linked on our website, cspan.org. You can go there. There's a summary that the GAO has included if you don't want to read the whole thing.
Well, I would tell you, you know, every American ought to read this. What it does, it confirms what most American suspicions are, is that in fact we don't really know what we're doing up here because we've not paid attention to detail. And when you don't, things get out of control and you're spending money that does not accomplish the goal. You're actually wasting a ton of money. So, and there's at least $100 billion that could be saved tomorrow if we looked at these programs, streamlined. Take job training. We spend $18.4 billion a year in job training. We have 47 different programs from 9 different agencies, 47 different job training programs, and all but 3 of them overlap. And none of them, not one of them has a metric on it. In other words, you were trained to a job, did you get one? Were you trained adequately? None of them have a metric. So you know, we could streamline that, eliminate 2/3 of the bureaucracy, put metrics on it, give more flexibility to the states, and spend $9 billion and get better outcomes. And if the American people would read through that report, what it will do is, number one, let them identify what the problem is, both in terms of programs, but also with their own Congress. They need to be demanding that we oversight every program in the federal government. That means have a hearing, discuss what it's doing, discuss its weaknesses and whether or not it's accomplishing its goals, and most aren't.
Real quickly, before we get to phone calls, I just want to get your perspective on the situation in Libya, because the AP is reporting that Gaddafi is warning that thousands of Libyans will die if U.S. or NATO intervene in his country.
Well, you know, I think the question, first of all, the United Nations has already voted not to intervene in terms of the no-fly zone. I'm not sure that's wise. I think one of the things that the world community could do would limit their ability to use Arab resources against their own citizens.
So you are in favor of a no-fly zone?
I would have no problem with a no-fly zone, but I think it's going to be very difficult to do. I don't think we get involved other than that at this time. But in terms of humanitarian aspect, you know, here's a leader of a country that has been there almost 40 years, I believe, and took that position through a coup, if I remember correctly. And now people are wanting freedom, and we're going to sit on the sideline and allow him to murder his own folks. I mean, you know, from a humanitarian standpoint, we ought to limit that if we can and not put ourselves at much risk.
All right. Lori is a Republican in Indianapolis. Thanks for waiting, Lori. You're on the air with Senator Tom Coburn. Go ahead.
Thank you, and good morning.
Good morning.
I was looking, it's funny that you're talking about this. I was looking at privatization as a way to reduce the government, to reduce the deficit. And I looked at 3 businesses or agencies in particular that are losing money, that have been losing money year after year, and it kind of ties into what you're talking about, where there's just no oversight that's been watching these things. So I'd like, one, your opinion on privatization applying to any company. What's the feel on Capitol Hill? Are they willing to look at privatization? The 3 companies I'm looking at are the Postal Service, which in fact is going to be on C-SPAN later this afternoon. I think they're testifying on Congress or on the Hill somewhere. I'm looking at Amtrak, and I'm looking at Freddie and Fannie. Now, the Postal Service, they have lost money. They have lost money for each of the last 5 years. They've lost $4 billion on an operating business. And then they spent another $2 billion on buying things like property and equipment. So I don't understand, one, why, if a company's losing money, we're still, funding them. What I'm looking at, and I'll just give you some ideas that I have, what I'm looking at on the Postal Service is, have we looked at FedEx and UPS? They have come to mind as 2 companies who might be interested in doing some type of partnership or maybe even a buyout.
Okay, Lori, we'll leave it there and get a response from the Senator.
Well, there's a couple of problems that most Americans don't know with the Postal Service is the Congress limits what the management can do in